Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for all of you coming today to our Big Ideas Distinguished Speaker Series. We have started this, if I may say so, the new project only a few years ago, and we have hosted several thought leaders, political figures, executives around the world from different countries with different capacities, ranging from, if I can give you a few examples, the former President of Ireland, Mrs. Mary Robinson, to Dan Burriett, who is the Secretary of Energy of United States, to recently 2018 Nobel laureate, Mr. Bill Northouse, a climate economist, just to name a few. The idea behind this event is to get new perspectives for our ambassadors, for countries, for our agency, from brilliant minds around the world, and we are so happy that we see so many interest for our event. But today's event is a very special event for us for two reasons. Normally, I have the honor to host one speaker, and I am so happy that in this case today I have three very distinguished speakers with us. The second reason why it is a very special event today is that this year we have announced that the year 2020 in the IEA is the year for clean energy transitions and how to address the climate challenge. This is our main topic, and we know that this will be discussed in the next minutes in front of us. Now, we are today truly honored to have three distinguished representatives of three countries who have or will have hosted the climate summit in their countries. If I can start with on my left, Dr. Michal Kurtyka, who is the Poland's Minister of Climate, who was also the president of COP24. And if you don't mind, maybe as important as that, he was the chair of the IEA ministerial meeting in December. Many of you know Dr. Kurtyka, and he is also very famous with his very brilliant picture, just jumping over a table after he had the agreement in Katowice. Many thanks, Michal, for coming here. It's a great honor to have you. On my right hand, we have the Right Honorable Kwasi Kwarteng, who is the Minister for Business, Energy and Clean Growth of the United Kingdom. And we all know that the UK will hold the COP26 to be held in Glasgow later this year. A very important meeting for all of us around this table, and of course for everybody. And third, we have also the pleasure to have Mr. Joan Groizard Payeras, who is the Director General of Minister of Ecological Transition of Spanish government. And of course, we all know that only a few weeks ago, Spain, in a very gracious way, hosted the COP in Madrid. And many thanks to the Spanish government for this gracious move. Now, in today's event, we are going to discuss, as you know, International Energy Agency. We are an energy organization. And but we all know that the emissions causing our climate challenge are mainly coming from the energy sector. Without solving the problem in the energy sector, we have no chance whatsoever to solve our climate problem. So therefore, we thought to having the perspectives of three very important country representatives here. What do they see, what kind of role the energy sector can play to address our climate challenge is the key question of today. And I am very keen to hear the perspectives of our three colleagues. But before going to and asking our colleagues to make their statement, I wanted to share with you a good news. In fact, we shared with the entire world yesterday. What is that good news? It was the following. There was a widespread expectation around the world that the 2019 global emissions would continue to increase. This was the main topic in Madrid discussions. This was the main topic in Davos, increasing CO2 emissions. But International Energy Agency announced yesterday that our numbers show, the real data shows that in fact, 2019 emissions stopped growing. It was flat. And very good news. Based on the data we have received from different countries. And it changed the dynamics, I can tell you, in 48 hours in the discussion. It is a grounds for optimism that we are seeing the signs of clean energy transitions. And in the report that was prepared by my colleague Lara Cosi and her colleagues, we say that there are three reasons why we had such a welcome development. One, strong growth of renewables, wind and solar. Second, natural gas replacing coal. And third, in some countries, increasing generation of nuclear power. So these are the three reasons that we have seen such a welcome development. But we believe, as International Energy Agency, that our now work is very hard in front of us. We want to make sure that 2019 is remembered as a year of peak of the emissions and then decline. This is our main task. And this is the reason why we take the clean energy transitions as a main issue here. Now, COP26 is an extremely important meeting for all of us, but we thought, since the energy ministers would play a very important role, to bring the energy ministers, energy industry together before COP would be very important. Therefore, I have written many of the ministers, I think all the ministers of the countries here, and the business executives that the 9th of July in Paris, we are convening an IEA Clean Energy Transition Summit. And I can tell you that only in a few days after we sent the invitations, we have received already very encouraging signals from many countries. So we are all looking forward to have a clean energy transitions of the IEA summit here and providing, hopefully, a very positive momentum for the Glasgow in United Kingdom. So with these words, I would like to thank all the ambassadors here with us today. A special thanks to Italian Ambassador Bernardini. As you all know, Italy is going to co-host the COP26, and all the business executives here. We have many investors, international organizations, and I wanted to remind all of us that this event is live streamed around the world, and there are several media representatives with us. Now, before going to word first to Minister Kurtyka, can you please join me to thank all three colleagues to be with us today? Thank you very much. So, Minister Kurtyka, can I please start with you, your perspective on the your experience and what role of energy sector can play here? Thank you very much.
Dear Dr. Birol, dear Fatih, Minister Kwarteng, it's a pleasure to see for the first time the alignment between Poland, COP24 host, then Spain, somehow a co-host of the COP25, and you, Minister, before Glasgow. And I'm very happy also to see you, Joan Payeras, from Ministry of Transition in Spain, because it is always a very important debate for all of us, how to make sure that the process in which we participate, which we are running, and Dr. Birol mentioned one of them, which is the climate process, but inside IEA there is another one which is linked much more with energy security. And by chance I had the pleasure to chair both of them in just 12 months ahead, one of the other. But it is very important to sometimes have a stop and, let's say, ask ourselves questions: where we are going, where we are right now, and what should be the next stage. And let me share with you just 3 remarks on this. And I will start with the credibility, because I think that what is extremely important in the climate process is credibility. And what was just said by Dr. Birol, the numbers prove credibility. If we are able to plateau the emissions, then the process is right. If we are not able to plateau the emissions, then there is something to be reflected in this process. But moreover, my experience from COP24 running in Katowice and delivering on Katowice rulebook has been a very intensive moment of intergovernmental negotiations. And as some of you probably know, a COP, Conference of Parties, is bringing together thousands of people. In Poland, it was more than 31,000 people who came to Katowice. But out of them, only a couple of thousands were negotiators, were representing their governments, negotiating Katowice rulebook, 100 pages document which implements Paris Agreement. And then once we achieved this Katowice rulebook, yes, there is a chapter which is missing. This is the famous Article 6, which is dealing with trading of CO2 emissions, international trading. It was unluckily not possible to reach an agreement on that during the last COP, Chilean COP in Madrid. But what I take out of it, after Kyoto divided the world in 2, the ones who are mitigating, reducing emissions, and the ones who are adapting to emissions, then Paris Agreement put everybody on equal level, and Katowice allowed it to implement, in fact, the rule book, which is necessary for this to be operational. Then my hypothesis is that it will be increasingly complicated to find new value in intergovernmental negotiations. And so the focus must be more and more from a couple of thousands of people who came as representatives of governments to Katowice to dozens of thousands, to 20 or 25,000 who came to Katowice because they have a message to pass, because they have a coalition to build, because they have a technology to propose, because they are engaged in the name of their region and their cities. So from my perspective, credibility will be increasingly linked with the word implementation. And if we are able to move the process of UNFCCC process more towards implementation, then we will be more in real numbers, more in the reality just described by Dr. Birol, and not as much at the level of intergovernmental negotiations, which are necessary, which are important, but yet again, starting from 2021, after Kyoto Protocol, we have the regime, the new regime of Paris Agreement and Katowice Rulebook, which will be in place. And of course, we can add to that new elements, but it's enough in itself to make countries accountable and to make them providing with nationally determined contributions. So, credibility, it is also the word which is extremely important when we think about challenges of the world. When we think about energy poverty, which is luckily decreasing very much, but still 800 million people around the world are suffering from energy poverty. What message can we bring to them? Are we in our right to say to them, stop your emissions, don't produce electricity because it is not convenient? Or should we rather help them, assist them, and allow for some flexibility in this regard? And when we are speaking about energy poverty, we should be speaking also about food poverty. One in every second children which will be born in the world in the coming 30 years will be coming from Africa. How are we going to help Africa in this big demographic shift, assuring the needs of food security? This is a challenge that we must all have in mind when we are discussing about credibility of the climate process. Then last but not least, let me focus a little bit on the European Union. Here in EU, we have a very ambitious target of getting us to climate neutrality by 2050. And climate neutrality is not a new word. It is the objective of the Paris Agreement. And climate neutrality means that we will be emitting as much as we will be absorbing by the second half of the century, which is stated in the Paris Agreement. But it is useful to have, it is extremely important also to have EU engaging and proposing a role model in terms of deployment of this climate neutrality for 28 recently and 27 countries right now. But this role model must be credible also in the aspect of balancing consumption with production. Because if we defined only climate neutrality as not emitting CO2 emissions in the countries which are part of this project, then we are missing the other half of the equation, which is what about consuming services and goods in these countries. So if the climate neutrality in EU can be a credible role model for the rest of the world, then it must tackle both production and consumption challenge. So credibility, it's an extremely important word. And when we are speaking about credibility, let me move to my second remark, which is linked with justice. I had the pleasure to run COP24 in Katowice, and during same days, 260,000 people were demonstrating here in Paris. There were yellow vests. They were not directly opposing objectives of the climate policy. I don't think so, at least as far as I can understand it. But nevertheless, they questioned the right share of costs within the society. So we will be, when we are going to move towards climate neutrality, we will have more and more social groups which will be asking ourselves the questions about burden sharing. And costs will be there before benefits. So we must ask ourselves the question about burden sharing. And sharing the burden is equally is not always just. I take the example of my country, Poland. Poland has been a country which historically a very large proportion of coal in the energy mix. This is how energy security also was built. This is also a country which is still less wealthy than some other countries of European Union. And when we are considering this climate neutrality target and this objective of moving all of us ahead together, then we must take into account the fact, the starting point, and also different endowment in capital in different countries. We are basically facing a capital-intensive revolution. Climate neutrality is demanding a lot of capital. Once we invested in a wind farm, once we invested in a solar panel, then electricity is provided for nearly zero. But somebody has to invest on it. And so we are confronted with the ability of countries to provide with enough capital. And so the question of historical endowment of capital and also GDP, nominal GDP per capita, is to play a role. So we will need to engage into a societal dialogue around climate neutrality. And it's not only about energy, although that is the topic today that we are dealing with today. But when we are speaking about energy, we are speaking about transport. Soon we are speaking about industry. We are speaking about agriculture. All these are as much technological, regulatory challenges, as much societal challenges. And if we are not able to discuss them with social groups, sector by sector, group by group, if we are not able to bring yet another bottom-up dynamic to this top-down discussion, then I think we will be missing fundamentally a very important point. And then last but not least is subsidiarity. When we are speaking about climate neutrality, we are speaking in many countries about different mix of technologies that we are having. Yes, there is an animated debate in many countries in the world about the role of nuclear, about the role of gas. It has been recently very much discussed within EU, whether yes or not the European Investment Bank should continue to invest in gas, or if we are not able to provide a field for development of new technologies, if we are not able to bring a laboratory in which new technologies will be able to, through experiment, through innovation, provide a piece of solution to this climate neutrality puzzle, then I think also we may be losing a point. And you, Dr. Birol, you just mentioned three elements of the decrease of CO2 emissions. So, and two of them were linked with gas replacing coal and increased share of nuclear. So two technologies which are very much right now debated. And innovation is key, and this was also the message of the IEA 2019 ministerial. So if we want to make sure that this transition is successful, then we must also be able to bring more resources to innovation and also provide a space for private businesses to bring solutions rather than impose solutions from the perspective of administration, even if we have the best wishes regarding that. So, credibility, justice, subsidiarity, around these three dimensions, I would propose to structure also part of the debate, if it would be possible to do so. And I'll be very happy to work, of course, with my Chilean colleagues, with my Spanish colleagues, assuming the role of COP25 presidency. But my hope right now goes to COP26 presidency and to British team. And I'll be happy together with my team to share with you all lessons learned and all the experiences of COP24 that I ran in Katowice, of this successful COP, how can we make sure that this is also your story? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Now, after Katowice, the next COP meeting was in Madrid. We have seen many leaders from different countries. Almost all the countries were present in Madrid. And you also organize an Energy Day in Madrid. It's a very good move, I would suggest. So may I now give the floor the Director General, Mr. Payeras. Floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, dear IEA Executive Director, Dr. Birol, and also for a very kind welcome at the start of this session. His Excellency Dr. Michał Kurtyka, the Right Honorable Kwasi Kwarteng, dear authorities, dear colleagues. In the first place, obviously, I would like to excuse the absence of our Minister, Teresa Ribera, Deputy Prime Minister for the Ecological Transition of the government in Spain, who is obviously extremely committed to the multilateral agenda, as was hopefully evident in the COP25, but unfortunately, government today is responding to the plenary of the Spanish Parliament, and therefore it was totally impossible for her to attend on this occasion. But in any case, it is obviously an honor as part of the Spanish government, with our commitment to climate neutrality, with our lessons learned from COP25, to be able to participate in this event on building an energy and climate coalition as part of the Big Ideas series by the IEA. And I think indeed we are at a point in time when we are very much in need of big ideas. Big ideas, obviously, in technical and regulatory aspects, but perhaps even more pressingly, and Dr. Kurtyka touched on this topic, perhaps even more so on the social, the economic, and the organizational areas. How do we articulate this broad grand coalition for the necessarily bold progress on climate action and energy transition that we need? The scale of the challenge that we are facing is known, is obvious to everyone in this room. The World Economic Forum, in its recent 2020 edition of the Global Risks Report, reiterated how the failure in mitigating climate change is one of the greatest risks facing humanity in the 21st century. Science is being very clear about the current and projected impacts of climate change on all aspects of our life and our economy, on current and future generations. And obviously, just over 4 years ago in this very city in Paris, we all agreed, everyone represented in this table, both public and private actors adhering to Paris as well, to limit global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And as you well know, only last year, the IPCC special report on this issue, on the warming of 1.5 degrees, was very clear in calling for rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. Rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented, and absolutely all aspects in society. Similarly, the emissions gap reports from the UN Environment Programme, it reports that current climate commitments can lead to a path of over 3 degrees of warming, which is obviously severely overshooting the 1.5 Paris target. And the IEA's own World Energy Outlook of last year shows that both the current policies but also the declared policies can take us nowhere near enough, either meeting the SDGs, the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development Goals, or the Paris Agreement. And only yesterday, as more recent data, and as Executive Director Birol was describing at the start of the session, the IEA was publishing key data showing how global energy-related emissions in the last year have flatlined. They have plateaued, despite still a global growth in the worldwide economy of almost 3%. So this is a change of trend, which is obviously very welcome. It adds and supports credibility to the climate process, as Dr. Kurtyka was touching upon earlier. But it is obviously a starting point, but it is also obviously nowhere near enough. We need to ensure that this is not a pause in growth, as the IEA was calling for yesterday. We need to ensure that we have reached peak emissions for good, and we need to ensure that this is the start of our pathway towards climate neutrality, a path that we need to start immediately, and we need to transit quickly, but inclusively as well. In this roadmap to carbon neutrality, and this is the key role the IEA can play, obviously, energy is the key. The vast majority of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are in the energy sector, so obviously the vast potential for mitigation lies in the energy sector. The energy sector, which, as you all know, is living a profound transformation, and is living a profound transformation in very different dimensions, starting obviously with the rapidly decreasing prices of renewable energy and the fact that renewables have overtaken fossil capacity as new capacity is being added worldwide, but also even talking about the inherent paradigm shift when you talk about the inherent scalability of renewables, the fact that both distributed generation but also flexibility tools such as storage, demand-side response, even other forms of sector coupling are inherently scalable and therefore can start at the very local level and be increased and scaled to the national or even regional or international level. So whether it's by policy design or by simply technological enablement, there is a new role for consumers, from the domestic to the industrial to the utility scale, who can become active agents in the energy sector, and therefore the benefits, when we talk about the benefits of the energy transition, these can be accessed not only by the usual energy players, but also potentially by other industrial and even also domestic or institutional players. The energy sector's contribution to climate mitigation is huge, both from a quantitative perspective, obviously, but also qualitatively in terms of the diversity of different tools and policy aspects available to us. If we put, for example, the Spanish Energy and Climate Plan as one example of many in this aspect, the more than 70 different measures that we are working on touch all sorts of policy areas, from energy efficiency in industry, but also mass refurbishment of housing, new auction system for renewable energy in Spain to become comparable to other countries, but also obviously send the right investment signals in the short, mid, and long term, and provide the right certainty to investment and innovation as well, but also measures on electrification on transport, but also modal change away from individual vehicles and which sort of vehicles are people choosing and why, and how that affects decarbonization. Strong push for decentralized generation and self-consumption, both domestic but also industrial scale, and even simply the access to data. So how consumers can access their smart meter data and how that affects the decisions that they are able to take and how informed their decisions on investment or energy efficiency or consumption patterns. That is also one of the policy measures we are working on. But despite the available technology, the technological development, the encouraging outlook, the recent data proves that it is a pause, it is a stop in greenhouse gas emissions, but we are not moving far enough or fast enough in our way to accelerating towards carbon neutrality. And I think this is what we need to keep in mind when talking about the grand coalition that I think we are already building, but we need to keep in mind in continuing to build. And I think this grand coalition can be structured in many different ways, but I propose 3 different lines that we can be thinking of. The first one, we need to think of a grand coalition of governments, of countries in the energy aspect. COP25 had an energy day, was host to multilateral as well as bilateral work between energy ministers. I think we need to use the COP, but also the IEA forums to develop work on multilateral action on energy, coordinate respective strategies, work together to convert the general, the strategic into the concrete and the specific, and to make sure that the policy and the investment decisions that we all take are compatible already with this long-term vision. The work of the IEA, as I mentioned, is critical in this, and the summit being called in advance in preparation for COP26, I think will be a fantastic opportunity to develop this work. I think in member states of the IEA or the OECD in general, at the very least, we need to be thinking very carefully about new investments in fossil fuel capacity, especially new investments in coal power plant, which are very difficult to understand in certain conversations or certain debates when we are committing, obviously, to decarbonization ourselves, but we are also demanding decarbonization efforts by third parties, by other non-OECD parties as well. And therefore, the compatibility of decisions today with that long-term strategy, we need to be very clear and very strategic about how we make those compatible. Secondly, as well as looking at a grand coalition internationally in terms of energy, we need a grand coalition with other policy areas. And again, Dr. Kurtyka was touching on this very wisely in his intervention. COP25 also showed us the value of multilateral work on other policy areas, including science, adaptation, finance, agriculture. After all, the energy and climate policy stretch way beyond the individual portfolios of any environment minister, any energy minister, any climate minister. Those responsible for mobility, infrastructure, agriculture, education and employment, research and development, land planning and resource use, all of these are obviously critical to be able to meet the energy and climate targets. It goes without saying, without the right workforce, without the right financial incentives, without the right taxation policy, we can get nowhere near enough our climate and our energy targets. In Spain, very recently, the government declared a climate emergency, and rather than it just being a political discourse, we wanted to make it a concrete commitment. We put forward 30 specific commitments in specific policy areas, And what's interesting about these is that they touch upon pretty much every policy area. The Ministry for Tourism, as you know, tourism is a very significant industry in some parts of Spain. The Ministry for Tourism is working on a sustainable tourism strategy and how we use tourism and are attractive as a potentially touristic country towards decarbonization. But also the Ministry for Public Infrastructure has been reformed into a Ministry for Transport, Mobility and Urban Agenda in charge of sustainable mobility and building renovation. So this is decarbonization agenda, this is energy transition, but it's beyond the portfolio of the, in this case, ecological transition, which is energy and environment portfolio. But thirdly, we need a grand coalition that goes way beyond governments, and I think that is also something that was very clear in COP25. I think COP25 has been building on increasing participation of successive COPs, and we have seen declarations and coalitions of countries, but also cities, regions, investors, utilities, but also businesses beyond the utility or the energy sector. One of the main outcomes that was interesting from our perspective of COP25 was the intense mobilization of the finance sector, for example. The Spanish banking sector, for example, 95% of the Spanish banking sector presented a joint commitment at COP25 to reduce the carbon footprint of their investment portfolio in line with Paris, with decarbonization by 2050. But also, as you well know, investors worldwide are already worried about the potential climate risk. The carbon bubble is something that has been written about and speculated about. The money is already following those concerns, and the regulators are following closely behind. We have examples such as the Bank of England, we have examples such as regulators in France or Spain looking at climate risk disclosure, climate stress testing of investment portfolios, and multilateral banks as well, such as the European Investment Bank, abandoning investment in fossil fuels altogether. But Madrid showed us that this idea of the coalition can go even further than the usual suspects, or maybe the main actors that have been key in the past. In COP25, what was happening outside of the conference center was as important, and in some cases even slightly more important, than what was happening in the conference center itself. We had economic actors and business groups hosting all sorts of activities, but also putting down very specific investment commitments, strategic partnerships, new decarbonization commitments in line with Paris. Cities and regions were committing to new ambitious targets and measures, and the marches and the pressure on the streets were making it very clear that climate ambition is something that is becoming a priority in our society, but also all the societies that were represented in the COP session. It's clear that we need this broad coalition to include business and industry if we are to actually take up on the economic and industrial opportunities of the energy transition, from the cheap energy provided by renewables, but also growing markets in digitalization, energy storage, electrification of heating, cooling, and transport, which is another of the big challenges, or even the competitiveness that comes in other industries with investment in energy efficiency and decarbonization and innovation. From new innovative products linked to the energy transition, how can a local community benefit from decarbonization, from electromobility, from decarbonized heating and cooling? There is a huge opportunity in innovative products in this area, but there's also an opportunity in streamlining and mainstreaming the energy transition into other activities as well. And as a final point, this grand coalition must always keep the social dimension at the center. And this means increased access to clean and affordable energy, obviously in line with SDG number 7, both in remote areas but also in city centers where energy poverty is becoming an increasing concern. Also in OECD, and even if we talk about industrialized countries, but it also means obviously a just, a fair transition where nobody is left behind in the process. In Spain, for example, this is an absolute priority. Our integrated energy and climate plan was presented in parallel alongside with a just transition strategy, and we are already working on the specific just transition agreements with the regions, with the areas, with the municipalities affected, initially with the phase out of coal mining and coal power production, but this will obviously grow into other sectors which need this accompaniment, which need the support in the process of this transition. We have currently allocated 600 million euro to this work, but we are continuing to develop both regional, national, and hopefully also European and international mobilization of financing to this work. As you well know, the European Union has launched a Just Transition Fund, which is obviously a very welcome and very necessary initiative, but we feel that it is insufficient in its current configuration, and we feel that it could benefit from additional criteria. Taking into account, for example, the social economic reality of each country and region, it is not the same to face a decarbonization challenge in a country or a region which is facing high levels of unemployment or economic activity, which is not comparable to maybe the most advanced areas in a European context. And I think here some Polish and some Spanish regions specifically share some of those challenges, but also the decarbonization effort that each actor is willing to put down, and also the work already carried out to avoid penalizing early action and ensure that the urgent needs are covered. This work requires funding, requires proper regulation, but it also fundamentally requires social dialogue with civil society, workers' unions, local communities. And if we do it right, there's a true opportunity here for these actors to be the true protagonists of the energy transition. If these actors are fully convinced of the opportunity of the energy transition, then the challenge of the spectre, if you allow me to put it in this way, of the yellow vests, the spectre of society not accompanying the energy transition, the spectre of society perceiving the energy transition as a risk to well-being, to quality of life, to economic development. If we do this work well, this challenge, this risk can become a true opportunity to make sure we accelerate the energy transition in a way that's inclusive and that is actually fair. We need to make sure, in any case, that society can accompany these changes, and the changes do not fall on the shoulders of the most vulnerable, locally, but also from a more wider perspective. In any case, and to conclude, what's clear is that nobody, no single actor, no single country can do this on their own, but we must also avoid the risk of using perceived or real inaction by other parties as an excuse for ourselves. We need to be able to commit and to prove our commitment to climate ambition. We need to be able to work in multilateral forums to prove and to have this international checks and balances system to hold ourselves and hold our colleagues not accountable, but supporting each other on the common challenges that obviously we will be facing. And in this context, obviously, you can be sure to count on Spain to remain firmly committed, not only to European 2030 and 2050 decarbonization targets, but also to work side by side in multilateral fora, but also with public, corporate, civil society, to meet our common goals. The work done by Dr. Kurtyka and his team in presiding the COP24, the Katowice rulebook for the Paris Agreement, means that Paris is pretty much in place. The phase of the negotiations, as Dr. Kurtyka was very well pointing out, is pretty much coming to the end. This allowed Madrid and the Chilean summit in Madrid to be called the Time for Action. Time for Action is starting. It started in Madrid, and we hope it can be consolidated in Glasgow. In this sense, we would like to offer our full support to the COP26 team, both the British but also the Italian co-hosts in this COP26 session in Glasgow, so that we can collectively ensure that 2019 was indeed not a pause, but a peak in global emissions, and that we can already be on track in 2020 towards our ambitious but inclusive track towards climate neutrality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Director General. Now, all eyes are on UK, Mr. Minister. It's a great honor to have you with us today, and we will be very happy to hear your perspective, Mr. Minister.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you once again for the excellent work that you, Fatih, have pioneered in the IEA, your excellent leadership, which has really flourished since 2015. And it's a real pleasure to be here among so many experts, so many people who are deeply and passionately involved in this hugely important subject. I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists who've dealt with many of the issues very comprehensively. I think it's difficult for me to add and improve on what they've said, but I can give you a British perspective on where I think our priorities are, certainly for this COP26 in a very important year in climate change and for this planet. Now, in this city, in Paris, 5 years ago, the world came together in a landmark agreement to respond to the imminent and very large threat of climate change. The Paris Agreement, I think, marked as I say, a landmark. And we all agreed at that time to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees and to pursue best efforts to keep that temperature below the 1.5 degree increase. But despite that shared commitment, we still have a long way to go. It's very salutary to hear from Dr. Birol that 2019 marked a year in which emissions did not go up. They really just held the level that they had been. But what we've got to do is to try and reduce those emissions. So 2019 is potentially an inflection point, but it's something that we have to work very hard to make sure that it represents, as you, Dr. Birol, said, a peak number and not simply a staging post to even more emissions. We've got to work very hard to prevent that. There are signs that are encouraging. You, Dr. Birol, said that there were 3 reasons why these emissions had been reduced, and one of them particularly related to the transition from coal to natural gas, and also the increased supply of renewables. And that's something we've seen over the last 5 years. The cost of clean power has fallen well below any figure that we expected. Solar and wind power are now cheaper than coal in around 2/3 of the countries in the world. I learnt recently that in the United Arab Emirates, solar power deals have closed at $12 per megawatt hour, and that's far cheaper than coal or gas. There are opportunities. There is an opportunity to develop low-cost, secure and clean energy to power all sectors of the world economy. And our challenge is to make sure that we do this in an expeditious, quick way, which can avoid the real perils of climate change. Now, with regard to COP26, last week, the British Prime Minister launched our COP26 presidency, and he made it very clear that we needed more international action to achieve global net zero emissions as quickly as possible. And the way to do this, in his vision, was through investment in clean technology, preservation of our natural habitat. There's a whole environmental aspect to this, and measures to also to improve our resilience to climate change. Now, as COP26 president, we call on all countries to strengthen their emissions reduction targets and actually try to meet the commitments of the Paris Agreement. In the negotiations themselves, we are committed to facilitating agreement on outstanding elements of the Paris rulebook. We want to see this as part of a balanced, negotiated outcome that realizes the full potential of the Paris Agreement and Convention. At the same time, it's vitally important that we alert the world to the growing risks, growing urgency and increasing risks of climate change. As the Prime Minister said, our Prime Minister, the policy themes of our presidency will be clean growth, nature-based solutions, adaptation and resilience, as well as finance, which was touched on by Minister Payeras. Now, in terms of clean growth, I think what Dr. Kurtyka said was absolutely relevant to this. He talked about credibility and numbers, and I think that's a really well phrased approach, a good phrase, which actually underpins everything we're trying to do. And we have numbers, we have a record of our own. In the UK, over the last 30 years, we've shown it is possible to achieve economic growth while reducing emissions. Since 1990, we've reduced the level of emissions, carbon emissions, by 42%, and yet the economy has grown by nearly 3/4. Now, some people say that this is partly because of deindustrialization, but actually what we've seen is a huge reduction in emissions from the power sector, from energy sources, which is what the IEA is all about. Between 1990 and 2018, those figures in the energy sector went down by 62%, far more than the carbon emissions in the overall economy, and renewables were a big part of that. The lower carbon economy should not only be seen in the context of a cost. I don't believe it is a cost. In the UK, we believe that there's a huge economic opportunity in the low carbon economy. We support now 460,000 jobs in the UK, and we think by 2030 we can increase that to 2 million, nearly, 5 times nearly the number of jobs that we have today. We are proud of some of the progress we've made, but we're also humbled by the fact that we have not achieved this alone. It's impossible to get this any measure of success without a great deal of international cooperation, and the growth of renewable energy has benefited from early support in research from developments in the US, in Japan, incentives for early development also in Europe, and there are large investments also in China and in India. It's a global effort. It's not just the triumph or success or failure of one particular country. My own background is in economic history. That's what I've got a doctorate in. And I was struck by the fact that if we look at coal in the UK, this was always a huge, huge part of the UK economy. And just a couple of facts. The biggest coal producing year was in 1913 in the UK. And that we produced we mined 287 million tons of coal. So that was 1 million tons a day. Just in 2016, that figure was now 4 million tons. So that's essentially 4 days in 1913 terms of coal mining. And that just shows the huge shift in emphasis in terms of energy that we've seen. And it was very significant the other week that the Prime Minister said that in 2024, we hope to fully eliminate coal from the power generation in our country. The power sector, I think, as you know, is crucial. But there are also other areas where we need to have a joint collaborative effort. Road transport is a major source of air pollution as well as emissions. Again, our Prime Minister showed a lead when he said that all new sales in the UK will have, by 2035, a zero emissions. Now, people are saying this is an ambitious target. Of course it's an ambitious target, but it's something which we feel we can deliver on. Not only power generation or roads, but obviously in industry, there's a huge need for stronger international collaboration. We want to work closely with partners around this table, around the world, in making sure that we get the right technologies to move to the point where they actually can be competitive. This year, we will be working with our partners in mission innovation to determine the next phase of our cooperation. Not only in industry, but we also want to access the opportunities of energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is clearly a major part of this story. Efficiency gains cut costs as well as emissions, and they also improve energy security. And that's another area where I think if countries cooperate to set high standards that keep up with technical potential products, such as air conditioners and motors, and also houses themselves, the physical infrastructure in which we live, can also improve rapidly in efficiency. There are huge opportunities from clean growth, and we in the UK feel that the story isn't simply one of reducing emissions, hugely important though that is. There are also economic opportunities out there. And people have talked, I think Minister Payeras talked about the developing world, talked about Africa, and I know that from my own family background in Ghana. People are wondering in Ghana, how are they going to develop and have the economic growth that they all want, while also trying to have a cleaner approach, a clean country and a clean planet. And I think in order to win that argument, in order to persuade people, we have to show that reducing carbon emissions is consonant with a growing economy and prosperity. And that was where I think what Minister Payeras said about fairness, about justice and fairness in this transition is critical. Now, COP26, let no one be in any doubt, is the top international priority for the UK government. In partnership with our Italian friends and colleagues, we take this responsibility extremely seriously. We've mobilized hundreds of dedicated COP26 staff across our government. We've also mobilized our entire network of more than 12,000 diplomats, and we are totally focused on expanding our network of climate and energy specialists posted around the world. Ministers are meeting within the British government every week to develop our strategy and coordinate plans. And we really, as a cry to the international community, we really call on your support in making this a year of global mobilization. As Dr. Birol has said, we must aim to put the peak of global emissions in the past. 2019, I sincerely hope, is the year of peak emissions. We need to reduce those emissions. And we also need to think about ways in which we can have even stronger cooperation in the future. As Mr. Payeras and the title refers to, as Mr. Payeras has said, we need a grand coalition. I think that's a really good, helpful phrase, not just of countries, but also of cities, businesses, and civil society, all committed together to action for clean growth and climate resilience. I look forward to working with as many of you as possible, with all of you, in this joint enterprise. And I think together we really can fulfill the promise of Paris and discharge our duties to coming generations. Thank you very much.
Mr. Minister, thank you very much for laying out this very convincing vision of your government for COP26, and also telling us that this is a key international top priority for your government. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Now, COP26 will be, of course, in UK, in Glasgow, but we all know that it will be jointly organized with Italy. So in that context, I would like to ask Italian ambassador to share his view. I had the pleasure and the honor, in fact, on just the day before yesterday, Italian Minister Costa visiting here us. I hosted him, and we had a very good discussion together with Mr. Ambassador. So we are very much looking forward to support also Italy in Milan and beyond, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I have to say that 2 days ago, when my minister visited Mr. Birol, I was surprised by an announcement that Mr. Birol said during the meeting. He said in a mysterious way, Mr. Minister, tomorrow we are going to make a big announcement. Full stop, without any detail. I was wondering what was that big announcement. Actually, the announcement was really big and was a very good piece of information that the emission stopped growing in 2019. And I think that that information has to be complemented with the fact that the economy kept growing. I think if this is the fundamental issue, emissions stop growing, but the economy is growing. As at the same time, this is fundamental. We all talk about clean economic growth as a paradigm for the future. Unless we are able to demonstrate that the economic growth is possible without increasing emissions, we are going to fail. And this piece of information is showing that we are definitely on the right path, and we have to continue to work in that direction. Italy has decided to join forces with UK in this undertaking of organizing the COP26. For sure, it will require a lot of commitment from all of us in order to achieve a good result. We all have in mind the Paris Agreement objectives, and we want to reinforce the commitment of the international community in that direction. There is a clear path of events that is taking shape looking at Glasgow. The Director General just announced the 9th of July meeting here in Paris. We will organize the pre-COP in Milan from the 30th of September to the 2nd of October. Pre-COP, we all know, is a fundamental event to prepare and set the shape for the final COP that will take place in Glasgow. So we look forward very much, along with our UK colleagues, to work in order that everything will be done to achieve a positive result. Along with the pre-COP, one thing that the Italian government has decided to organize from 28th to the 30th of September is an event dedicated to youth for the COP. This is something very, very important and very relevant. We all know the impact of the UN Youth Climate Summit in New York. We cannot ignore what the youth around the world are saying on climate change, and for sure we need to avoid that the climate change becomes an intergenerational fracture. On the contrary, we need to join forces, all the generation, in this effort to achieve the results that we have in mind. So youth will be coming in Milan. They will participate to the meetings, not only among themselves, they will have opportunity to interact with ministers and with delegation. I think it's very important that their voice is heard and we have a possibility to interact with them. We, of course, look forward to a broad participation of youth from all over the world. At the same time, we want to dedicate a lot of attention to Africa. I think has been mentioned by my neighbor, Mr. Kwarteng, about the relevance of Africa. We look at Africa in terms of access to energy. We look at Africa in terms of adaptation to climate change. For sure, it's a continent that is heavily hit by the climate change. We cannot avoid, and we want definitely to pay all the attention that we can to Africa, and we'll do it as well as in the context of the event in Paris. This year is a key year for us, it's a key year for UK, but I'm sure that we have all in mind that and the year after we will be chairing the G20, UK will be chairing the G7, so for sure this is a commitment that is going to last more than this year. Our commitment is there to make the fight against climate change successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Now, we will be having a few minutes for some questions, comments from our ambassadors, what they have in mind, what they would like to share with the three important governments who hosted the COP meetings. But before that, if I may, why did we call this meeting Building an Energy and Climate Grand Coalition? It is an issue that we have raised some few months ago because, to be very frank, when you look at the debate is around the climate change is very much heated, maybe too much heated in my personal view, and there's a lot of tensions between the energy community and the climate community. So we think it is this discussion need to take place in a cool-headed manner, and in order to avoid the temperature rising. And here we think there is a role for the International Energy Agency because we work with the energy sector. We are the voice of the energy sector, but we know that the climate change needs to be addressed. And it is the reason we thought to bring around the world, when we look at the order of magnitude of the challenge in terms of climate change, in terms of numbers, that this situation calls for building a grand coalition, bringing governments, energy industry, investors, all other stakeholders who are genuinely interested to tackle the climate challenge. Without building this grand coalition, it will be, in our view, very difficult to address this global problem. It is the reason we are very happy that today we have, again, governments, several representatives of the energy industry, investors, and others with us. And 9th of July meeting that you will see many ministers around the world. They have already confirmed, both from the advanced economies, but also from the developing nations, as well as the CEOs of many energy companies. I can assure you, on the basis of my own observations since years, a big chunk of energy community is ready to be a part of the solution, if not all. We should understand that the energy is not a problem. Energy is a good thing. Emissions is a bad thing. So therefore, we have to make sure that we understand energy is a part of our economy. And as the Italian ambassador mentioned, we both need the economic growth, but the emissions coming down. So here, dear colleagues, I would like to suggest that we ask in the groups of three questions, and have start a good, frank discussion here. Who would like to start to that? I see US, followed by Denmark and Kenya. United States, please.
Thank you very much, Fatih, for bringing us all together today, and thank you to our three speakers who provided some good food for thought. The United States is very pleased to hear these ideas about moving to action. Let's not get caught up in the rhetoric. The reference to all sorts of different fuels that are out there, different technologies. Certainly, the United States is very supportive of this approach, as all of the above has been our energy policy. And we were very happy at the announcement that was made on the new data that showed that while the United States economy was growing by over 2% in 2019, we reduced our emissions by 2.9%. So it is possible. Now, my question has to do around how we pull this grand coalition together in practical terms, because I think, as many have cited here, that it's important that we join forces, but we're often find ourselves pointing fingers and sowing divisions. And we have multiple objectives. I was very pleased to hear references to the need to reduce poverty, to increase energy access, that energy security is important, even as we're addressing climate change. So in practical terms, I think you've offered a framework for us to think about, but I would be interested in how you think we might do this and go from rhetoric to action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I now move to Denmark, Mr. Ambassador?
Thank you very much, Fatih, and thank you for organizing this. It's fascinating. It's a unique experience, I think, to have the opportunity to look at history in the making, so to speak, moving from COP24, 25, 26 here. So thank you very much for that. Could I say that first of all, going back a little bit, we had a parliamentary election last year in June. That was the first time in 20 years that other things than migration and asylum seekers were the top priority of voters. Actually, we did the polling. The top priority of voters in Denmark was climate change. It was, as mentioned also by our Italian colleague, the whole intergeneration discussion, what you also mentioned in terms of the youth movements all across Europe. So climate change is now at the forefront, and it's consistently that, also on post-election polling. So that has, of course, made the government move on this, and you're all familiar with the decision, the law that we actually adopted in December, of a 70% reduction of CO2 emissions by 2030. And to be very frank, of course, we can account for part of that, but we have no real clue right now about how to reach the last 10 percentage point. That, of course, is picking up from the British minister's point of view, that is the opportunity part of it. That's the moonshot moment that we see in this. That's the job creation, that's the technological innovation, that the positive thinking that this can actually create. And I think that is basically, I think, the approach that we should have for that, also in getting into the Energy and Climate Grand Coalition. At the same time, of course, this is what we will take on with us to COP26. A lot of ambition, a lot of hopes and hard work to make countries pledge to do much more than they did 5 years ago in Paris, and that to increase the level of ambition globally in terms of CO2 emissions. One of the key elements there, and we can see that, and the British minister mentioned that, will be coal. And I think this is an excellent, IEA is an excellent body to discuss this, because you basically look at all sources of energy, and we know that we will have coal with us for a long time to come. But at the same time, we see countries move in the same direction as the UK, that we are, and that was also part of the new figures that you put out yesterday, that we see a decrease in coal production and coal consumption. So we see institutional investors moving away from coal. We see private pension funds moving away. We see multilateral investors moving away from fossil fuels, and especially coal. So what will be the role of coal in the future, and how will we address that at a global level? I think that will be part of the discussion that this coalition will definitely need to take on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. May I now go to, as the last question is this round, Kenya, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to the speakers for this excellent presentation. Kenya is a small country, But when it comes to energy efficiency, renewable energy, we have already met our targets for our nationally determined contributions since the Paris Agreement. In terms of renewable energy, in terms of accessing the latest technology, as a small country, we're faring well. However, as we're discussing issues to do with the Grand Coalition and what we're doing going forward, as a country, we are still seething from the lack of the ambition in COP25. What I would like to know is, especially with the presence of the COP26 presidency here, what guarantees do we have as small countries to avoid some of the incidents that I don't need to get into that we experienced at COP25, so that when we come as delegations, we are prepared that we must finish this meeting on time, that we must see a level of ambition, which I hope that this Grand Coalition is going to pave the way for that. We also saw that there is a gap in terms of the Warsaw implementation, and in this I'm referring to the issues of loss and damage, which for us, given our geographic position, are still a major issue. What I'm asking, basically, as diplomatically as I can, is, do we have guarantees of success? We're now preparing for COP26. Out of the 26 COPs, I think I've been to 20 COPs. And if I recall why we made significant achievement in Paris is because the French government moved around for almost 3 years, working with all governments, working with the private sector to ensure that we had a degree of success and a degree of commitment. So I just want to know, what assurances do we have in terms of us as Kenya and in terms of us as African countries on the success, on the major issues that touch on us at COP26. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. Just to make a small editing what you said, Kenya is a small country, but also a great country, Madam Ambassador, as we all know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam. So we have 3 questions, if I can summarize. So from United States, how can we build a grand coalition? From Denmark, the role of coal. This is an important issue as well. And from Kenya, how do we guarantee, or can we guarantee the success from COP26? So I would like to now ask our colleagues here, perhaps in 2-3 minutes, if they can touch upon these 3 questions. Mr. Minister, can I start with you, sir?
Thank you very much, Fatih. I think I'll take the questions in the order that they were presented. With regard to moving rhetoric to action, I think forums are very important because, yes, there are lots of words that are exchanged in forums like COP, but also there are things that we decide to act together. And I think the Paris Agreement was something which focused people's minds. There has been action. I think policies that we have done in the UK, which I know about, have also brought about huge change in this area. I mean, I mentioned coal, which I will touch in the second dealing the second question, but that didn't happen just by accident. That was policy, that was international discussions, that was commitments, that was something that was formulated internationally as well as a part of domestic policy. So I think in terms of the power generation piece, there is a lot we can do cooperatively, and also that we have done in the recent past that can drive change in that. And I think continued dialogue and participation in forums is absolutely key to that. In terms of the second question, I think the coal story is a huge story. I think when you look at for example, Germany, they've said that they will come off coal, I think, in 2038. That's a long time in the future, and it is a problem. It's still something that we have to deal with. But again, I think that certainly in the UK's example, that's something that is achievable. I was trying to suggest that there wasn't a country in the world that was more dependent on coal than the UK. Even in the 1980s, when we had miners' strikes, coal was at the center of economic and industrial progress in the UK. But we've managed to, almost without any real effect, we've managed to reduce that footprint. And I think that's a success story. And I think other countries are looking to do the same thing. So I think we can wean ourselves off coal production and consumption more quickly as a global community than many people think. Now, with regard to the third question, which is probably the hardest one, so I left that to last. In international agreements like this, we can't guarantee success. It's not something that we can gold plate and say this will be a success. Obviously, people will also ask, how do you define success? What I can commit to is the fact that this is absolutely our number one priority as a government, and it makes sense. It doesn't. It's almost a coincidence that we are having the COP26 presidency. We also have the G7 presidency in 2021, and this is in the year of. I haven't mentioned the word yet, but well, you know what I'm going to mention. I mean, I don't even need to mention it. The fact is, international diplomacy is right at the center of what we're trying to do as a government, particularly in the context of leaving the EU. And so all our efforts are directed to this. I'm confident that it'll be a success because we really can't afford it to be a failure. It's not just on a global level, it's also on a national level as well, given where we are with Brexit and other issues. So I can't guarantee success, but I can guarantee that 100% of our efforts will be directed squarely to making this thing work and successful and memorable. And I will guarantee that.
This is music to our ears, Mr. Minister. Thank you very much for that. Now, may I turn to Minister Kurtyka? Would you like to elaborate any of these points?
Thank you. I think the history is in the making, as Ambassador from Denmark said, but the history is right now in Glasgow, in making. It was already made in Katowice, so I'll be very happy to contribute to the success of my colleagues in Glasgow. But I think that bringing two communities, climate and energy community, together is an excellent idea. And I had the pleasure to be part of the governing board of IEA for a couple of years in my quality of Secretary of State in the Ministry of Energy at that time, and I had the pleasure to run COP. So both are very close to my heart. But indeed, as Fatih said, I think it is important to get them together and to get them think together about how common objectives can be achieved. And it can be done at various levels. Ambassador said at the level of governments. It is indeed how can we bring such a format to life. That would be a very practical step. But that's also at the level of companies, at the level of cities, regions. This is what I'm saying when I'm saying that we need to somehow focus next COPs on implementation, because next COPs will be also variable geometry schemes will be more present. It will not be only the intergovernmental scheme which will be dominating the whole discussion. I'm convinced about that. I think that one of the progresses which were made in Madrid, referring to loss and damage, was the review of the Warsaw loss and damage mechanism. And we are very happy about that it was part of the achievement. But nevertheless, when we are speaking about next challenges for Glasgow, we are somehow also probably not putting enough emphasis on the transparency framework. Minister, this is something which was left in Madrid, not yet finished, and this transparency framework is absolutely at the heart of the 2021 agenda. Thank you very much for mentioning for Ambassador from Denmark also the fact that there are lots of uncertainties in which we are. Yes, the last 10%, as you mentioned, we don't have a clue how to get there. And this can be seen from both sides. Either it's a nightmare problem and nobody and says no, so we cannot move, or we say, okay, let's take it as an opportunity. And if it's an opportunity, then it should be debated at the level of energy and climate Grand Coalition, for example.
Thank you very much. Mr. Director General, you want to add a small contribution as well?
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol. Addressing the issue raised by the ambassador from the United States, indeed we are often not only different actors, but having different conflicting priorities, or apparently conflicting priorities in many occasions. And at least in our experience, what we did is try to incorporate it into the energy plan. So for us, the energy plan is the industrial plan, it is the energy poverty plan, it is the infrastructure plan. For us, it is not so much about not doing things or delaying doing things or opposing priorities, but in fact trying to do it well. It means you take longer to get it right because you need more discussion, more dialogue, more consensus. But when you do get it right, it's a lot more solid for the energy aspect itself, but also for the other priorities. So I think mainstreaming the energy agenda or the climate agenda into other policy areas, I think, is key. To address the issues raised by the ambassador from Denmark, I think when we start talking about climate neutrality or carbon neutrality, suddenly there's a bit of an epiphany moment. When you talk about incremental reductions in carbon emissions, everyone feels comfortable in the last few percent. When there's a 30% or a 20% left, everyone sees themselves quite legitimately hiding somehow in that final percentage. When you talk about the entirety of climate neutrality, then it becomes very obvious that everyone needs to act. So even the more difficult to decarbonize sectors, which are very obvious and very much discussed, it becomes very obvious that absolutely everyone needs to figure out what their new role in this scenario is. So it's obviously a challenge, but thinking about long term and thinking about the net zero is very constructive in that debate. And you raised the issue of the role of coal, and that's a big debate that's happened, for example, in Spain as well. And what we've realized is that if you look at it from and it sounds like a paradox, from a technological neutrality perspective, the conversation is not so much about coal itself, but it's about jobs, it's about national energy security, it's about cost and cost competitiveness. It's even in our case about legacy. So in Spain, the historic importance of the coal communities, not only for the economic development of the country, but also even for labor rights and some political developments, is very, very important. So if you're able to first have energy resources which are cost competitive, that are distributed from a geopolitical perspective a lot more interestingly than perhaps a lot of fossil fuels. A lot more countries have a lot more access to renewables than perhaps other energy sources. And when you also have specific mechanisms to address a fair transition, to accompany the sectors, and also to recognize the legacy in our societies, in our economies of those communities, then perhaps you can afford to sort of leapfrog or move forward. So coal is the apparent issue, but it's so many layers behind that we need to sort of address one by one. And finally, just to respond to what the ambassador from Kenya was addressing, I think indeed in COP25 we saw some small but hopefully positive steps towards addressing loss and damage, issues to do with the Clean Climate Fund and how that expands its scope beyond mitigation and adaptation to loss and damage, the Santiago network to mobilize technical assistance to vulnerable countries. But obviously it is indeed very small steps towards a very significant issue, which again, all the support we can bring to the COP26 to address in more detail will be there.
Thank you very much. So we are now very late with the timing. So I suggest that we have 6 flags. We will take all of them as short as possible, and our colleagues will react to those comments and questions, and we will finish it there. Can I start with Mr. Ambassador, Japan?
Thank you. I'm very brief. Thank you very much for this occasion. It is really a wonderful occasion to think about this great coalition. I have one suggestion and one question. One suggestion is that Japan is also a country who is really a keen policy for clean energy transition. And my suggestion is that innovation is very, very important for the future strategy. And hydrogen and carbon recycling are both very, very important technologies. So I really wish you to put in mind that those two technology will be, innovation will be quite important. Secondly, my question is for development. This great coalition must be aligned with development as well. And Minister Kurtyka rightly drew our attention to this energy poverty. And also, most of the carbon emission comes from developing countries. So we should not avoid this very important. You see how to align with development and carbon emission in terms of energy production. In fact, in Africa, they are using charcoals, and they are burning charcoals for the cooking and their daily life. And also, they are cutting down trees and destroying a forest. And in the developing industry, because of the very unstable power supply by the public sector, public energy sector, they are obliged to put on independent generator and burning fuels. And all that we have to think about it. And electrification is really one important solution for that. So providing electricity is top priority to help the developing countries to reduce emission. In fact, we need to save people from energy poverty, but also we have to encourage the development of African countries. So, Mr. Birol, you have, Dr. Birol, you have put it. This coalition is energy coalition between energy community and climate community, but we also think about the coalition with development community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I fully agree with you. In fact, if I can pick up one of the points that Mr. Kwarteng mentioned, the issue of coal. In fact, many of you mentioned. In some European countries, it is right, the coal is going to have an early retirement. The government policies, some of them early, some of them less early, but it is happening in many countries. But in European countries, coal power plants generates electricity for the fourth television set in the kitchen, whereas in India or other some developing countries, they are providing electricity for the villages, in the refrigerators in the villages, for the parents to keep the medication for their children. There is an issue of equity here, and how we can bring them together is a very important challenge for all of us. So different countries, different priorities, different economic development challenges in front of them. It is the reason at the IEA we came up with this grand coalition, which I will also say a few words later. But now may I go to Singapore, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Executive Director. Thank you very much for inviting Singapore to this meeting and conference. Very useful idea about constructing a grand coalition on climate and energy. And thank you very much also to the distinguished panel for their insightful comments and remarks. I'm not sure whether Singapore is in a position to give grand ideas or big ideas about how to forge this grand coalition, but perhaps, if I may, I'll just take a few moments just to seed some principles which are important, I think, as we go forward. And these are not really grand or even novel ideas, but I think that it needs to be re-emphasized. Number one, I think what we need to emphasize is the fact that multilateralism is under strain at this point in time. So this is an opportunity for all of us, essentially, to try to bring together a global consensus on something which is going to affect us over the longer term. It's not just our generation, but the generations to come. And I absolutely agree with the speaker from Spain about the need for us to bring youth together, because that's a very important point to make. And I think the ambassador of Italy has also mentioned that. Number two, I think one of the principles that we have to start from is to honor and implement the pledges that we all have made under the nationally determined contributions. We all know that we are now at a stage where we have to renew that, and we have to submit new NDCs. And I think that we should start from there and start adhering and honoring the commitments that we made. The one thing that I noticed about this, we've noticed about the NDCs as well, is that there is a difference between what countries have pledged under the NDCs versus what countries, or some countries, have pledged under the very successful series of climate action summits. And I'm just wondering whether there is a possibility at all for us to fold the pledges made under the process of climate action summits into the UNFCCC process. And I think that if that can happen, we are going to have something which is probably going to be a much improved version of the Paris Agreement. Number three, we need to work on completing the Paris Agreement, the work program, the rule book. And the speaker from Poland, of course, the minister from Poland has mentioned this before. It's important that Article 6, being the last remaining piece to complete the rule book, be completed. And the effectiveness of the multilateral rules-based system of global climate change rests on us completing this outstanding work. It's imperative that we adopt a credible, clear, and coherent set of rules. And we also need to try to bring together all the different processes that are happening in order to address climate change. You're talking about, of course, the processes in the IMO, and the ICAO, etc. And if COP26 would be able to try to bring that into fruition, that would be highly appreciated by Singapore. Number four, mobilize national climate actions. And I think this is it behooves on all of us as countries, essentially, to try to give more energy and put more energy than even before to mobilize national climate actions. For Singapore in particular, as a country which is disadvantaged when it comes to renewable sources of energy, we have to depend on fossil fuels even now. And it is going to remain a very strong component of our energy strategy over the course, over the foreseeable future. But what we have done is identify 4 switches. And working on the basis of 4 switches, we think that we'll be able to make our contributions. Number one is, of course, we continue to use natural gas. And this is the fossil fuel that has the least carbon emission. Thank you very much, Dr. Birol, for highlighting this as one of the findings of the report that you announced yesterday. Number 2, we've got to talk about essentially using the regional grid system. And this is something that we are working with our neighbors in Southeast Asia as well, where we can leverage on the grid system. Number 3, we're talking about, of course, going into further research and innovation. And thank you to the ambassador of Japan as well for mentioning this. Innovation is very important. Where we can have low carbon-based sources of energy, that's what we have to use as well. And I just make my last point, essentially, which is the need for us to strengthen solidarity through partnerships. And I think many of the speakers around the table that have taken the floor, Mr. Chairman, has also mentioned the fact that we need to work with the other stakeholders. I'm very happy to see, of course, representatives from enterprises around here, and, of course, international organizations. And I think that we do need to bring to make it more inclusive, and I'm very, very happy that the word credibility, inclusivity, and of course subsidiarity have been mentioned in this panel. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm really sorry for taking some time, but I hope that these points can be considered as we go into COP26. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Much appreciated. Now, may I turn to Canada, Madam Ambassador?
Bonjour. I'd like to congratulate all of you for your leadership, and thank you, Fatih, to organize this discussion. Clearly, as you know, Canada, I've got one comment and then one question. So as far as the comment, clearly Canada sees the transformation to a low carbon future, not only as a responsibility of its generation, but as the opportunity of a lifetime, and therefore it is a priority for our citizens, but also a priority for the government. This transformation, while keeping energy both affordable and reliable, will require significant investment, more than governments can afford on their own. And that's why when you're calling for like the grand coalition, I think the importance of how we're gonna find the investment to make it happen is very important. In Canada, the private sectors clearly need certainty before they will invest. So we are providing policy certainty by presenting a transparent national plan on climate change, including a price on carbon pollution. We have also modernized our regulatory system to give companies the certainty they need to invest and move projects forward. So my comment is also like how we will kind of build that grand coalitions and find the grand investment and how we can work to implement such a thing. My question is, all of you refer to the social dialogue, which is important in this current point in order to bring credibility, as you were mentioning. So could it be possible to have more clarity about what in this important GCOP would be these elements of that dialogues on social? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. Mr. Ambassador, Australia.
Thank you, Dr. Birol, and thank you for our speakers. It's been a fascinating session. I think the signs are encouraging. If you look at the IEA data that you put out yesterday, it shows that the advanced economies actually their emissions peaked, energy-related CO2 emissions peaked in 2007. So that's very encouraging signs. So Australia, we have a pretty strong Paris target. It represents a 2/3 reduction in emissions per unit of GDP by 2030, so 2/3 reduction. But our view is that we need to pull every lever at our disposal to meet these targets. So renewables, battery storage, pumped hydro, energy efficiency, cleaner fossil fuels, and deploying carbon capture and storage. So I guess my first comment is really the all fuels, all technologies approach we really support. As an example of that, for example, our natural gas exports are estimated to have lowered emissions in importing countries like Japan and Korea and China by around 150 megatons of CO2 last year by displacing coal. And just overnight, our chief scientist gave a very important speech in which he emphasized the incredible potential of hydrogen produced from natural gas or coal using CCS technology. So again, all fuels, all technologies, I think is the right approach. But reflecting on the speakers that we've heard today, we heard about emissions reductions, security and reliability, and affordability. And all of those goals, to me, indicate there's trade-offs. So my question is, are we getting the right information on trade-offs and opportunity costs? And what do the speakers see as the role of the IEA in clarifying those trade-offs and informing countries about those costs going forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Last two interventions, Mr. Liebreich.
Thank you very much. I'm very honoured to be here. I hope there are no other ambassadors that would like to speak, because frankly that's more important than anything I could say. Thank you for the three very good interventions and also for the various questions. I just wanted to, as you go into building the grand coalition, Dr. Birol, but also Kwasi, as you build towards the COP26, there were three, in a sense, sectoral points that I want to make sure are reflected. There's a lot of attention always on the electrical system. There's a lot of emphasis always on transportation, these processes. So I just wanted, if I could, highlight three sectors that have huge importance in achieving any of these goals. The first is energy efficiency, and I'm honored to be one of the commissioners on the IEA Commission for the urgent acceleration of energy efficiency. If we're to see news like yesterday's news about the emissions flat or even for them to start to drop, we have to dramatically increase our ambition on energy efficiency. It has to deliver a few percent every year, 1 or 2% more than it's been delivering historically, and I hope the Commission can help. I would love to see that folded into this process of the coalition and also COP26 and beyond. The second sector approach, or the second area where the Grand Coalition could potentially maybe miss, and I think it's very important that it doesn't, is infrastructure. Because there is lock-in with infrastructure, whether it is countries like Kenya, Madam Diplomat, we heard your intervention, who will be urbanizing, building your cities, building your transportation infrastructure, but even a country like the UK, we saw yesterday's announcement on HS2, building public transport and also building infrastructure. If we lock in the wrong infrastructure, we will be on a path we can no longer correct from. So no, it's not energy, but I think we've got to reach out beyond energy and into particularly the infrastructure space. And the third sector that needs to be well reflected in these two converging processes is finance. And I've been lucky enough to spend 15 years or so shuttling between the financial sector, the business sector, and the policymaking sector, and to a certain extent diplomatic, but less so. And one of my lines has always been that there is a wall of money ready to be deployed if the conditions are right. If the conditions are right. And of course that means that from a risk-return perspective. And there's a big discussion about Article 6, I get it. There is money ready to flow if you can fix Article 6 one way or the other. But don't forget, please, that there is this wall of money, you could almost say a huge wall of money, that is ready to flow domestically, north-north, south-south, and in areas that will not be even touched by Article 6. And so a strong theme around finance and unlocking finance and just tipping the balance so you make more money from the clean stuff than you do from the stuff that is emitting will be hopefully well reflected in these processes going forwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ribera. So two final, very brief interventions. One is from BNP Paribas, then the other one is the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Thank you, Fatih. My name is Mark Lewis. I'm head of sustainability research at BNP Paribas Asset Management. So I'm on the investment side. I'd actually just like to echo what Michael Liebreich just said. Things are moving tremendously quickly in the private sector and within private finance. Renewables, we've heard a lot from the distinguished panel about the speed with which the cost of renewables has been falling, but the returns are not falling. I had a meeting yesterday with the CEO of one of the world's largest oil companies who is investing now increasingly in renewables, signed a solar deal in a Middle Eastern country in the last 2 weeks for a price below $20 a megawatt hour and is still making a double-digit return on that project. So there is money to invest, as Michael said. We want to invest it. And the practical question that I have for our panel on this is we haven't yet heard anything about fossil fuel subsidies. And eliminating fossil fuel subsidies would go a long way to removing a very significant source of distortion in the global energy market, and would help move the world more quickly to a decarbonization pathway consistent with the Paris Agreement. So I would like the panel to comment, if they can, on what plans there might be to make this a talking point and, more importantly, an action point at the COP26 summit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. International Atomic Energy Agency, please, last word.
Thank you very much for inviting us in this meeting. Thanks for nice presentation, clear view. And thanks, Dr. Birol, for probably for the first time mentioning the role of nuclear power at one of the three pillars. Now we are in the country France, where the lowest carbon dioxide emission because of nuclear power. And now we have the new design, 3+, that implemented all lessons from the previous events. And we strictly believe that not reaching 25% by 2050 production of nuclear power, we cannot fulfill obligations of COP25. So we need to raise more about the nuclear power role in reaching the climate conference's goals. And thanks for inviting us to be that climate grand coalition. As concerned at Kenya, I can tell that according to our projection by 2050, that energy consumption per capita is almost the same like now. It means that poverty is the same, that forced migration is the same, that what I can recommend and tell that only huge deployment, vast deployment based on good infrastructure, safe and reliable nuclear power can save Africa and the world. Thank you.
So thank you very much for all those comments. Now, we have a very challenging job now because we are very much beyond the time that I promised to all of you. Some of the colleagues will take a plane, I know, and they are going to leave as they travel from long distances among the also participants and panelists. So may I suggest the following, starting again in chronological order of the COP meetings for three our distinguished speakers, starting with Minister Kurtyka. 2 minutes, if you want to pick up any of the points that our colleagues have highlighted, 2 minutes, which is the most important for you from your perspective to highlight. Minister Kurtyka, please.
Thank you very much. COP24 was based on three priorities: people, technology, and nature. And I think we succeeded in bringing to the international agenda these topics about just transition and solidarity. Nobody can be left behind, and the question of social cohesion must be at the heart of any climate policy if it is to be successful. And yes, we can deliver on that if we can convince people, if we can convince our citizens that new economic model, that the shift in the paradigm shift that we are working on does not mean worse quality of life. It means a different quality of life. And if we can discuss with our societies about that, then I think it is an effort worthwhile. Worth doing. The second point is technology, and here we didn't speak that much about the shift to electricity, but in the 21st century, energy will be increasingly electrical energy. If I recall correctly, right now 30% of the worldwide energy production comes from, energy needs comes from oil, 19% from electricity, but this share of electricity will be growing. And it was mentioned that new renewables are extremely cheap right now. Yes, we have very cheap solar, very cheap wind. The challenge is how to incorporate this cheap electricity within a system which remains robust. And so that is how to deal with intermittency. That's an enormous field of cooperation, of international agenda around storage, around local dimension, about demand-side management, about cyber security issues. So this is all that we need to touch upon. And last but not least, I will not mention about nature that much, although that was also an important point. Forestry, the role of absorption, nature-based solutions, this needs also to be. But last but not least, hydrogen. It's interesting to move forward around this also, let's say, carrier, because that's not that is a source of energy which needs to be created out of some other source of energy. So if we work on making hydrogen more popular, using it as a storage, but also working on how it is produced, then I think we can have also some new solutions on the table.
Thank you very much. Mr. Director General, briefly, please.
Trying to be very quick. One of the main points, equity, must be a founding stone of the coalition between nations, between generations, and even within societies as well, with the most well-off and the most vulnerable. Secondly, very much welcome the remarks made by the ambassador from Singapore, also reminding that Spain and Singapore work together on COP25 to push for more ambition, but it's critical that we are able to deliver on that ambition and prove that indeed the NDCs that we are putting down are not only ambitious, but also realistic and fulfillable. In terms of social dialogue, as brought up by the ambassador from Canada, how do we make this effective? In our case, just two very specific examples: the just transition agreements in specific areas affected by coal phase-out, national government, local municipality government, workers' unions, but also small business people, small and medium enterprises in the area, which can mobilize a lot of the investment and the opportunities in those areas. And the second example, a citizens' assembly on climate change, which we are learning from other initiatives in Europe and worldwide, where gender parity is important, intergenerational representation is important, and to make sure that it is not just even the climate or the energy community talking about climate change, but it is society at large. And finally, obviously, infrastructure is an absolutely key aspect. The fact that investment decisions today need to start being compatible with long-term decarbonization. If we lock in the wrong sort of investments, we can go down the wrong track and miss climate targets, but also miss that certainty, that long-term investment certainty that we need to provide. And a clear path for that is obviously removing fossil fuel subsidies to ensure level playing field. In our case, for example, our new law on climate change and energy transition, which we are putting forward, eliminates new fossil fuel subsidies and mandates the government to have a comprehensive review on energy taxation to ensure that we indeed have that level playing field.
Thank you very much. Mr. Minister,
thank you very much. There were 5 themes that I picked up in the last round. Finance, I think, was brought up by Mr. Leibreich, BNP Paribas, and the Canadian ambassador. Green finance is key to all of this. I totally accept, being a former banker myself, that there are huge resources that are waiting to be invested in this area. And that's going to be one of the themes that the Prime Minister talked about for COP26, how we mobilize capital, because as the Canadian ambassador said, government can't afford to pay for this entirely itself. There has to be a dialogue with the private sector. On innovation, the Japanese ambassador mentioned that. That's absolutely key. I mean, one of the things that I'm working with my team in Britain is CCUS. We had a manifesto commitment as the Conservative Party in the election to CCUS, and a key component of that, and a corollary of CCUS development, is the use of hydrogen, the production and use of hydrogen, and that's something that we're very focused on. The nuclear industry, nuclear was brought up by IEA, also by the Australian ambassador. And I think the phrase that the Australian ambassador used in this context, all fuels, all technologies, that's very much at the center of certainly my approach as energy minister and the government's. We feel that we got to have a wide source of supply, not only because of security, but also because of cost. Our analysts show that a wider degree of supply actually is a good way of keeping down costs. The fourth theme, NDCs. Yes, I think Mr. Payeras put it very well. You know, the NDCs have to be ambitious, but they also have to be achievable. They have to be things that, so there's a tension there. There's a creative tension between something that's very ambitious and something that can actually be reached, and that's something that we are absolutely focused on ahead of COP26. The last issue I'll deal with was social discourse. I think that was brought up once again by the Canadian ambassador. I think what the Italian ambassador mentioned in this context is vitally important. I think it's really significant that in Italy we are having a youth forum. There's a youth section of COP. I think that's incredibly innovative and exciting. And also across the piece, just very broadly, we've just come out of a general election in 2019 in Britain. And I've been a candidate in 5 general elections. Every election since 2000, including 2005, I have been a parliamentary candidate. This was the first time that climate change was an issue. And it wasn't just a minuscule, minor issue. It was something that was right at the center of voters' concern. So there has been a huge amount of progress. A lot of these debates are being socialized, but of course we can always do more in that line. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. So, dear colleagues, before finishing, this is the rule of the game here. Our guests, I asked them, because I am the head of the agency, 300 people. We have our members, family members of the IEA, responsible about 75% of global energy use and CO2 emissions. We have very big responsibility. Since I have such bright brains here, I wanted to ask them if they were to give me, as head of the IEA, a piece of advice in 30 seconds, which is, of course, implementable, I hope. What would you suggest me to do in the year 2020? I start on my left, Mr. Director General.
very quickly, and if I dare, if I may, just three very quick pieces. The first, to continue to work with members and accompany them in the big pressing challenges. How do we phase out coal? How do we implement storage, for example, technically and regulatory? So first, the accompanying of the members in these big challenges. Secondly, developing and building on the interaction between decarbonization and security. A secure energy system, we believe, needs to be a decarbonized energy system, and there's themes in financial security, but also a broader energy security behind that. So security would be a second thing to develop in the link to decarbonization. And finally, although the IEA does not prescribe but project scenarios, and I know this is a debate that has been had, we feel it would be interesting to facilitate a roadmap that looks at climate neutrality by 2060, 2080 worldwide, OECD countries 2050, and helps facilitate the sort of policy discussions that we need to be able to really pursue best efforts for the 1.5 target in Paris. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. They are all easily implementable, so no problem. Thank you very much. Now, Minister Kurtyka, please.
Thank you. Excellent. I join my colleague from Spain. So points were very, very important. I can only encourage you, Dr. Birol, to continue this journey of bringing together energy and climate community. If I can add something, then let me go deeper into the question of solidarity and just transition, how the burden sharing in terms of cost can be analyzed, and what kind of solutions, recipes can you provide to member states in terms of equal burden sharing, and I think that this principle of equity and justice will be increasingly important in this discussion. And last but not least, if we want to tackle the climate change at global level, then somehow we will be obliged to distinguish between consumption and production. So what are the consumption patterns, what are the consumption, production and consumption patterns, and how they evolve, and what it is saying to us about possible solutions.
Thank you very much, Minister Kurtyka. Mr. Minister.
Very quickly, I think you're doing a fantastic job. I think there's nothing to be improved upon. Well, one or two things, but I will just by way of, I will humbly submit three areas where I think we can make even more progress. I think continuing to be a forum for international discussion is vital. I think it's really, really important that we keep talking. I know people say rhetoric is one thing and action is another, but action has to start with ideas. And I think having big ideas forums is absolutely critical to what you're doing, and this is brilliant. And the more, the better. The second thing I think I would call pathways. I think the Spanish minister mentioned this. I think having a roadmap, maybe one roadmap for OECD countries, maybe one roadmap for more developing countries. But I think the IEA focusing on a kind of strategic path would be a good idea. And the third thing, and I would say this as a politician, is the public. I mean, how do we engage a wider public? And that's something that I think you can think about in the IEA. It's not a technical issue, but it's something which we all really have an obligation to engage with. How we can socialize these ideas, not just here, but out on the street and across our communities. I think that's really important. And I think the IEA potentially has a role to play in that space.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. So to sum up from IEA perspective, I can tell you that we are working on two very important guidelines. One, we are going to come up just before our 9th of July meeting, a roadmap for the entire world, how to bring the emissions between now and 2030 at a very deep reduction. In other words, is emissions reduction in a hurry, because we have a hurry between now and early peak is very important. As Mr. Minister mentioned, we want 2019 to be remembered as the peak year of global emissions, because there is no CO2 emission coming from Jakarta or from Liverpool or from Detroit. They have no passport. They have the same impact on everybody. So therefore, we want to come with this global view. how to bring the emissions down between now and 2030, which buttons to push with the existing technologies. Second, however, we want to also provide a long-term vision, the carbon neutrality of the energy sector, and here our guidance will be, our motto of the IEA, and some of the ambassadors mentioned, we look at all fuels and all technologies. We don't believe that we have the luxury, given the situation the world is in, to just exclude this or that technology because we don't like it. Any technology which helps us to reduce the emissions is welcome, of course, depending on the country. So we are going to come up with a roadmap to 2030, and also we will come with a longer time horizon to bring the carbon neutrality of the energy sector. And we came up, finally, with this, the concept of Grand Coalition, and we are getting a lot of attraction. And these two documents will be the narrative or the guidelines of the Grand Coalition. And you can be sure, I can guarantee that we will work with everybody who is really and genuinely, I underline the genuinely here, interested to bring the emissions down. But we will not forget that our core mission of the IEA is also energy security. It can be electricity security, oil security, and economic growth is something that all the countries would like to see. So I would like to thank everybody here, but also my best wishes for Minister Kwarteng. Mr. Kwarteng, in front of all the ambassadors, to thousands of people listening us, I can tell you the International Energy Agency is fully and unconditionally supporting your co-presidency. Please join me to thank all of the three colleagues here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Yes. Thank you, Minister. So, thank you very much, and best regards to Teresa, please. Thank you.